Ardal O'Hanlon is finding out just how 90 minutes can divide generations now in RT2 as he heads to Poland for the Krakow derby in leagues apart.
When you think of Holland, you think of windmills and clogs, canals and dikes, maybe Vermeer and Rembrandt. I have to say, when I think of Holland, I think of Johan Cruyff and Marco van Basten. The biggest match in Holland is by a long shot Feyenoord and Ajax. It's a tale of two cities, two Hollands possibly.
The Feyenoord Ajax game is one of a kind.
It's a big rivalry. It's like Glasgow, Rangers, Celtic, Barcelona, Real Madrid.
It's always tense. The hate between Ajax and Feyenoord is huge.
Amsterdam wasn't always like this. Up to the late 60s, by all accounts, it was a grey, God-fearing backwater.
Holland had been a very quiet, religious, authoritarian society where, you know, you listen to your superiors and you listen to your elders, and on Sundays everybody stayed in. And there wasn't much money around either.
Drugs and prostitution and any sort of flamboyance wasn't tolerated at all.
In the 60s and 70s, Europe's becoming much richer. Turns out there's an enormous amount of gas in the north of Holland. The country becomes much, much richer. And so suddenly you have this generation of people growing up in the 60s, post-war, who, you know, wanted to enjoy life, wanted money, and it was a very radical disruption in a very quiet and religious country.
But then along came the Provos and Johan Cruyff. No, not those Provos, not the IRA. I'm talking about the provocateurs, Dutch radicals who turned street protest into an art form. Provos, as far as I know, were a playful anarchist group who wanted the police to dress in white and hand out free chickens to the poor. Now, in 1966, one of the Dutch royal family married a German. So the Provos threatened to spike the water supply in the city with LSD for the crack. Their non-violent street protests were brutally crushed by the police, which caused a bit of an outcry in the full glare of the world's media. Well, the police chief was sacked, and Amsterdam, a very short time later, became a beacon of tolerance and a hippie mecca. This is where the biggest hippie of them all, John Lennon, and his lovely wife had their famous bed-in for peace. While they were arsing around inside, Ajax coach Rinus Michels and his gangly protege Johan Cruyff were perfecting a concept every bit as important as world peace: total football. Tossing aside rigid formations, Michels' brainwave was all about brilliant players in constant motion, changing positions at will and utterly bamboozling their opponents. This total football brought Ajax extraordinary success. Now a global brand, Ajax have the obligatory space-age stadium on the outskirts of Amsterdam. This is the Amsterdam Arena, home to Ajax. It's a really magnificent stadium, but it's got a kind of slightly fancy corporate feel. There's actually a quote by Ruud Krol: "Football is not an art, but there is an art to playing good football."
Brilliant.
Yeah.
As a player, he was one of the absolute greats of that era. in the 70s. He played in the 74 final, the World Cup final, one of the hardest defenders in the world, playing with love beads, you know, hippie love beads, which have been given to him by an English girl on a Greek island, some romantic gestures some 2 or 3 years earlier or something. Just a really complicated, interesting guy.
Hello, good
My name is Ardal O'Hanlon. I'm from Ireland.
My name is
Irish
Ruud
TV.
Krol.
I know that.
Nice meeting you.
I'm a big fan of yours since I was a child.
Thank you.
Can you explain to me, like, why football is so important to the Dutch people?
Well, of course, before our first big success in the World Championships, football was not so big in Holland. But after that gives us a very big stimulus to get the people more enthusiastic about football. When we had the big team, when I played in the big team with Ajax, we had sometimes 18,000 people. The stadium was not full. And here, nearly every game it is 50,000 people.
Beyond the football field, were you in any sense like the Beatles of Holland?
Yeah,
Because we think you were.
The Beatles was
you were very important to the Dutch
the
people.
Beatles was something exceptional.
Yes,
But of course,
did you represent something similar?
yeah, that is true. It is also true that wherever I come, and we were talking about that World Champion '74, that the people not talking about the World Champion, they're talking about the Dutch team who become second, how they like the football, and that of course was very important for us. That period put Holland on the football map.
The loss to the Germans in '74, in tactical terms, it was just, they were much better than the Germans. The Germans expected to lose. Everybody expected the Dutch to win that game, including the Dutch. And after they score a goal in the first 2 minutes without the Germans even touching the ball, they then, for historical reasons, because the Germans had invaded and humiliated the Netherlands, they then made fun of the Germans for 25 minutes, which looked great, but was an extremely stupid thing to do.
I remember crying with my father. You know, I couldn't believe that I lost. You know, like, and the whole generation grew up like, you know, like boys when they were really like into football, and then we lost the most important game you really could lose.
Cruyff has this ludicrous theory about how Holland really won the '74 World Cup because nobody remembers the German team. So yeah, I mean, all these things have been very pernicious and led to this creation of a sort of belles lettres football where everybody just does, everybody plays prettily and then we lose, but that's okay.
Cruyff was not just the best footballer of his generation, he is arguably the best-known Dutchman of all time. He personified cultural revolution in Holland. He is, in fact, the Dutch John Lennon. A few miles away in Hilversum, I picked the brains of the top sports presenter in Holland. His weekend show on national TV is the most watched programme in the country, and he's a personal friend of Cruyff. Why do you think football is so important to the Dutch?
It's all because of Johan Cruyff. Before Johan Cruyff, of course, we had Sir Stanley Matthews and we had Bobby Charlton and George Best. Johan Cruyff is, in my view, the most important Dutchman, not only of this age, but of centuries ago as well. You had the Beatles in England, and in football you had Johan Cruyff, long hair, and he argued with referees. You don't argue in the beginning of the 1960s with a referee in England or in Ireland. You wouldn't do that, of course. No. Johan Cruyff did.
Cruyff was a guy who, in football and outside football, didn't care how things had always been done. I mean, it was like he'd arrived from Mars, and people said, oh, well, it's always been the way that the members of the board, the directors, fly first class and the players fly second class. And that if the plane crashes, the directors are insured and their wives will be paid out, but the players are not insured. And if a player is injured in a big match and never plays again, well, he doesn't have an insurance. And Cruyff said, well, I don't care. And it hasn't always been the way in football, of course, that a 17-year-old new kid shut up for 5 years. Cruyff, at 17, at Ajax practices, was telling people where to run. So outside football, he was the same way. He was very resented as well at the time. You know, the interest in money was seen as wrong. His bossiness, his willingness to argue, all very disapproved of. I mean, now Cruyff is beloved in Holland, but at the time he was very much...
Well, he's seen as very rebellious.
He was a rebel, yeah.
Towards the end of his playing career, Johan Cruyff, the Ajax legend, contrary as ever,